Welcome back to our session number 3 of the Frontier Forum, where in today's session we'll be talking about the embodied future, how XR will transform our relationship with AI. And the reason for this choice, particularly this week, is not only because we've been actively investing into the space for the last 3 years or so, but particularly because I was at GDC at the Game Developer Conference last week, where we talked to countless founders in this space and have been, taking a deep dive into how will we actually be using AI as consumers in the coming years, because it's staying local to the phone doesn't make all too much sense, because the way that AI works essentially needs to tap into different senses, which we'll talk about today. So diving right in. Before we talk about AI, before we talk about XR, let's talk about a little bit earlier in the technology period. I want you to think about like 2003 to 2008. Do you remember how you used the internet in that time span? And maybe you can think about it. It's probably too hard to type out right now, but just try to step back if you're old enough, hopefully, how that era felt. To me, at least, I was old enough to use the internet at the time. We were using forums. We were using chat rooms, maybe like an ICQ, maybe a Skype, right? Google search existed, but back then probably you're not using Google, you're probably using MSN or a platform like that, right? Of course, one of the most popular sites was AOL, America Online, where it was all kinds of services packaged neatly amongst it. But chances are your internet consumption from 2003 to 2008 was very different than it is today. And when you think about today, most humans, most people in the Western world are probably spending at least 8 to 10 hours connected to the internet. Whether you are watching me right now, presenting investment theses, whether you are chatting with a friend on, WhatsApp, whether you are reviewing your friend's weekend on Instagram, or whether you are calling yourself a ride on Uber, or, the list goes on. Essentially, the internet has penetrated every area of our lives. And so when smartphones came out, let me circle back. It's not the internet that changed in this time period, but rather it's the medium of how we consume the internet that materially changed between 2007 and 2010, roughly. You saw this major boom in new applications come out, of course, because you needed a smartphone to have applications, but these applications could have existed, on a computer, and some of them did, but materially less successfully, right? And so what we saw is that from 2005 to 2023, the average time spent on the internet per day has gone from 1.5 hours to roughly 7 hours a day. And it's the medium that made all the difference. Because when we're looking at, the internet was technically capable of, right, enabling social networking. We did have MySpace before Facebook, right? It was technically capable of music streaming, right? We had platforms like Napster and so forth, where you could download music, right? LimeWire. But it wasn't as big as Spotify, right? Video sharing, YouTube did exist. I did watch some YouTube before I ever had a smartphone, right? But not to the levels that it is today, when people are essentially taking it with them wherever they go, and it's become the new form of TV and and news, if you want, by default, right? And even ride-hailing, right? Like, could somebody call it a cab? Maybe VR, the internet browser, sure, but that's very unhandy, because the time when you need it, you probably need a phone in your hand, right? So a lot of these innovations, right, needed smartphones as a form factor to truly take off. And on the right here, you see the YouTube's user growth, where yes, they had some users and they were growing, but then when the true smartphone era happened, they just started growing in massively different leaps and bounds. And so when a new groundbreaking technology enters our lives, right, it does take us time to adapt. It takes time to understand this technology, and it also takes time to figure out the most intuitive ways to integrate this technology to our lives, right? So initially, having the internet just on, a tower, or just on a desktop was useful, right? In and of itself, it was useful. But to truly harness the usability, right, you did need a new form factor, which was the mobile phone. We're currently experiencing the same thing with AI, because AI, like the internet, is revolutionary, but similar to the internet, AI is currently limited by its computing form factors, meaning laptops, computers, and smartphones. The big mission that currently a lot of VCs and investors are chasing is the idea of AI embodiment, right? How can you give artificial intelligence eyes, ears, a mouth, other senses, and also the ability to do things, whether that is digitally or physically? And there are two different schools or two different approaches to this, and they are not either or, but rather they both serve different ends. One being humanoids, meaning building entire robots that act and function like humans. And then there's extended reality, which is, or in the bigger bracket would be smart wearables, right? On the one hand, humanoids, you've got companies like Tesla being the leader, right? With also some private companies like Figure and Aptronics following up closely. Figure, for example, raised a closely $40 billion this year, and then Aptronic raised a $2.6 billion this year. When it comes to extended reality, it is Meta in number one, right? It is currently still Apple in number two with the Apple Vision Pro, although it's small. And then Google is launching their own devices with Samsung in September. Now let's compare these two. I mentioned the importance of AI embodiment centers around autonomous senses, right? Because for an AI to be really useful, right? Like right now, you use a chatbot probably, ChatGPT, Grok, Claude, and so forth. And everything's text-based, right? You tell it what you need. You like, please edit this, or give me your insight on that. Please research that, right? But it always lacks context by default unless you give it context. To truly tap into the power of AI, right? AI should be able to see by itself. It should be able to hear by itself. It should be able to talk. It should be able to show things. It should be able to do things, right? And so the two different approaches are following, right? The humanoid, of course, will have a camera in its head, just like eyes, and it can see what's in front of it, right? It can hear commands. It can hear sounds, like maybe in a factory that there's an alarm going off, right? You can talk to it, and it can talk to you, right? If it's an educational robot, right, it can show you. Let's say it's a cooking robot. It could show you how to make a meal, right? Or if it's a training robot, it can show you how to do like a high risk task, right? And of course, can do the work, right? The main customers for these humanoids currently is industry, right? Because these are expensive. They're like $200,000. So they can do very repetitive, monotonous, but probably high risk, or also where high accuracy is needed, physical tasks. And they can run 24/7, unlike a human, right? Now, and when you do the math, $200,000. Some of the jobs they're replacing might also cost $200,000 a year. Maybe they cost $100,000 a year, which means the robot pays for itself in a year or two. Now, with extended reality, I think this is the part that people are missing. People think it's just goggles, right? I got all of them here in the background. You've got the Apple Vision Pro, the Meta Quest 3, and the Meta Ray-Bans. We can even take these ones, for example, right? The Meta Ray-Bans are technically not AR glasses, they're just smart glasses, but they still are, in a way, helping embody AI. Why? Because with these glasses, they've got a little camera here. So now all of a sudden, they can see what I see, right? They got a microphone in there, so they can hear what I hear, and they can also hear me talk. They also have a speaker in there, so now they can talk to me, right? Showing is with this thing falls short because this is just a smart glass. This is not an AR glass, which we'll talk about today. With AR glasses, also display. So like you talk about something, you queue up something, it can show you a map. It's like, hey, where should I go? It pulls up a map. It shows you, right? You're looking at a building like, oh, what's this? It tells you historical context, right? You're looking at an image and you're trying to like analyze something. It can figure it out for you. And then doing the way to think about it is that, like, while of course an AR glass can't do something physically for you, right? It can do digital tasks for you. And I guess I don't want to jump ahead, but the mental framework that I take with AR classes is that really it turns the human into a quality assurance for AI agents, right? Because all ultimately the workflow will be that AI agents do all the work and they show you the result on the glasses and you say, yep, good to go. Nope, pass, send it back, make these changes, and so forth. So now all of a sudden, all the work that you used to do in the services business, glasses are doing for you. And so, but to take a step back before we get into the nitty gritty of AR and VR and so forth, philosophically, the way to look at these two industries is that humanoids are aiming to almost merely replace human work for now, because that is what is commercially viable. It is for most, it is not commercially viable to buy a $200,000 robot for anything other than, a factory, essentially, right? Sorry, I've gotten sick. Of course, traveling to GDC, a week of conferencing, you get catch cold. Now, when it comes to extended reality, on the other hand, it is more about enhancing the human experience, right? So we're not replacing us, but rather we're saying, how can we take our capabilities and take them up a notch? How can we turn somebody that's 130 IQ into 140 IQ? How can we turn somebody that's maybe socially timid into very social? How can we take somebody that has bad memory into having strong memory, right? All these things I said are possible with this intersection of AI and XR. And so for 2030, to get some estimates of like where these industries are growing, Omdia expects there to be about 38,000 humanoid robots being shipped. We're talking about shipped, not contracts and so forth. We're talking about actually shipped in the hands of end users, right? So the expectations for humanoids are ranged from 38,000 to as bullish as 1 million, right? With AR glasses, the expectations are much more narrowly aligned, where the numbers tend to be anywhere from 13 to 20 million, which those are, meaningful numbers. 20 million is maybe like, 7-8% of the United States. And unfortunately, 2030 is coming up closer than we think. It's only 5.5 years away, or 4.5 years away. 4.5 years away. Crazy. But so essentially, you're looking at two very, very different, total addressable markets in this time frame, where we're still extremely nascent, which also makes you think twice about the current valuation of some humanoid companies, versus us being essentially close to already for being a mainstream product on the AR side. What does it look like? We'll get to in a second. But before then, robotics and XR, it's important to say, like, I'm not trying to knock humanoids. I think they're 100% happening. I think you can make an amazing amount of money investing in probably more in niche robotics, less so the most popular names like, Figure and so forth, where, you are already a late stage buyer. But when it comes to robotics, there's a lot of awesome opportunities for like, niche products of how can various workflows, tasks, and just human needs to be automated and done more efficiently using robotics. That makes sense because it's a physical way of embodying AI. However, when it goes to about anything digital, XR is the more useful and the more near-term solution, because essentially we are enhancing the already best robot that's out there, which is the human body, right? And even physicists and people like in robotics will acknowledge that like humans are already like incredible, both in terms of mental capacity and physical capabilities, which is why do you think robots are now becoming humanoids? Because the human shape works pretty well, right? Like they had all the chances to like use a different form factor, but the human body works. And so, XR taps into that, right? But ultimately, both of them will dramatically reshape not only how we interact with AI, but also how deeply it is integrated into our lives. And so while humanoids function largely as industrial hands in the near term, AI will become the ultimate human co-pilot, right? Because AR transforms our AI relationship as it sees the world at our level, it hears our surroundings, It speaks and shows us text and visuals that can enhance our surroundings. And all that makes sense because ultimately, when you look at the US economy, for example, by now, 76% of the economy is service driven, right? So while humanoids target maybe I think it's like 15, 16% or so, the other part is agriculture, which is also very small. The 76% are less routine, less repetitive, and require a combination of cognitive and physical skills that likely make enhanced humans more capable than humanoids. And so that means that while there might be 200,000 humanoids out by 2030, there likely will be 50 million, 100 million AR classes out by 2035, and every human will use them both for leisure and for work. And so the reason we are bullish on XR right now, timing wise, because I believe I'll probably be investing in robotics sometime in the next 3 years or so. But for now, we are all in on this XR space. And the facts are essentially outlined very simply here, right? One category is ready for the mainstream now, where there are millions of units already distributed, humanoids several years away. Cost factor, XR costs about $300 for glasses or VR currently. So the price point has already gone down to commercial levels versus humanoids, $200,000 on average, right? They range from as low as 100,000 to as high as like $1 million. When you talk about go-to-market, it's equally important. How do these two go to market, right? Humanoids will need to run the regular B2B grind, meaning they reach out to various companies that could benefit from, improving their workflows and, automating some of the workforce, right? Where XR can actually benefit from regular B2C virality, meaning the more users use it, and the more developers find useful ways to enhance their own lives and publish apps, right? Which then make them better, then the other person wants to be better. And then all of a sudden, it becomes a self-supporting loop, right? Where a burgeoning app ecosystem on AR, for example, will drive more users. And then you want to become an an early adopter, because obviously it's making you more efficient. And so that is a viral loop that we haven't tapped into yet, which we'll discuss, what are the catalysts on the horizon. But that's something that can certainly accelerate things, where it's essentially a pull, not a push, in terms of the go-to-market, where the customers come to you. Furthermore, regulation is something I think worth keeping in mind. There is a very clear path. I think the only caveat about smart glasses, probably not in the United States, but probably in the EU, is the camera angle, right? Because people will be wearing cameras on their faces 24/7, and so there will be regulation. Or I believe after Google Glass, the EU had regulation already that you can't have them on inside. I believe part of the reason why Meta has the light on one of the sides, where whenever you're recording, the light goes on, that is to be regulatorily compliant, right? So I think that's something that the market will figure out, but it's a smaller hurdle, because guess what? We're all already carrying cameras with us 24/7, right? Whenever something happens, there's like 5 people pulling out their phones and recording, right? So this is not news. I think this is a low barrier to overcome. The harder regulatory maze is not even technological, but I would say philosophical, where you have at least one side of the aisle, right, push back against humanoids. Why? Because they steal our jobs, right? If we can make an enemy out of immigrants, we can also make an enemy out of humanoids, right? If all of a sudden they're laying off entire, factory floors to replace them with robots, right? You already know there will be Democrat senators and representatives pushing back against it. Republicans might push back for different reasons. Maybe they'd say, hey, if let's say one of them ends up having a monopoly, that they don't want, one private company having a monopoly over the next robot army, and how much oversight should the government have, right? Like how many robots is a company even allowed to own before they become a threat, right? Like there's all kinds of questions that linger that can certainly stunt growth. And I firsthand experienced how like how regulatory nightmares can stunt growth, like in crypto, right? I think this is a very obvious trap that various governments can walk into, right? And when that's the case, when most of these companies already have massive high burns and they're selling 5-digit units, I think the odds of there being a short-term winter, meaning right now everybody's hyping up humanoids, that there's a short-term winter in in 1 or 2 years, possible, maybe 3 years, because they just raised rounds. Secondly, high multiples, right? So in XR, you can actually achieve pretty high multiples because right now nobody's investing in it. So there's like 5 or 6 investors, like VCs in the world, actively allocating to XR, us being one of them, and us actually being, I would argue, the most active in terms of number of deals done in the last 2 or 3 years. Where you can back a company at a 10 million valuation, 20 million valuation that is like fundamental to the entire industry. It's like it's like a keystone piece to the ecosystem, right? Meanwhile, humanoids, if you want to back anybody relevant, you're already in the billion dollar valuations, right? Even though they haven't shipped anything. Like Apptronics raised 2.6 billion, they're still prototyping. And then of course, ReadyTech versus R&D. So that's kind of like the highlight of those two. And the reason I did present those two is because not even because I'm trying to make humanoid tech seem less relevant. I think it's huge. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about like, hey, should I be weighing heavier into this myself? Right? Because I'm in deal rooms where I get access, for example, to the Apptronic deal, the last round where they raised, I think, was it like 1.6, 1.8 billion, something like that. So I had access to that round. I thought about it, but the space just seems overheated to me. And both are ironically pursuing a similar goal, but 99% of investors aren't clicking that they are, right? For most people, it clicks, okay, humanoids, automate work, AI embodiment makes sense, right? The same thing doesn't click when it comes to XR, even though the core capabilities being having a camera, having a microphone, having speakers, right? Being able to like do tasks digitally or physically, right? It's the same, except it's 30 grams, not, a multi-ton robot. And so, and I guess on the right side, there was something about market size, but we can skip that. Essentially, what the market size said is that the VR market will become as big as 1 trillion with a T by 2030. Humanoids only 38 billion. And then we're talking revenues here. So now let's dive in. We talked about like why we're focusing on XR. XR being in a fantastic medium and modality for AI embodiment. What I want to do now, not real quick because this is a big part of the presentation, is actually breaking down the differences between VR, AR, and MR, and then also how that ties into this specific thought pattern of AI embodiment in particular. So let's first start with virtual reality. VR is virtual reality, and what it really is immersive simulation that fully replaces your surroundings, right? So what we're looking at here is the Meta Quest 3, right? This is the new leading device. Meta Quest in general makes up roughly 95% or so of all the VR hardware out there. Okay, so Meta Quest is the leading system, leading hardware, leading operating system. Everybody else is noise. Well, to give one additional company credit, it's that Sony PlayStation VR 2 is also a material market. They've also sold a couple million units. In fact, they recently lowered the price. They're selling more now than they did at launch. And whenever some of my content teams like studios are publishing like games there, they make sometimes as much money on PlayStation VR as they make on the Quest 3 because the PlayStation ecosystem tends to be higher quality users that are willing to pay for things. Okay. But essentially, VR means you're fully immersed where you don't see anything from around you and everything is purely virtually created. And so how big is that market, right? Meta has sold at this point, it's estimated somewhere between 35 to 40 million headsets. One of the last official numbers was about 25 million back in beginning of 2023. So it's been 2.5 full years since then. They did launch the Quest 3 since then. So again, we're probably somewhere in the 40 to $50 million range. 40 to 50 million unit range. What's interesting is that tracks roughly with the sales of the iPhone in the first 5 years when the iPhone first launched. People like to forget that the iPhone 1, 2, the iPhone 1 and 2 weren't popular, right? It took until the iPhone 3 that the iPhone really started doing material sales. In terms of public companies, that are innovating in the space, because I always love to, give both private and public examples. On the hardware side, it is hands down public companies, right? It's Meta leading the pack with like 95% traction. Then it is Sony with, again, another couple million units, maybe coming in at like 4%, right? I now put Google above Apple, and the reason I put Google above Apple is because Google is launching their own headset in, I believe, September, right? Price point is going to be somewhere between Meta and Apple, so it's going to be like $1,000 something most likely. And I have high hopes or high belief that Google will outsell Apple very, very quickly, because Apple made the mistake of just selling one of the most overpriced tech devices in history for like $4,000 that ultimately very few people bought, right? On one hand, I do believe they sold out because they only ran a production of 500,000 units. So they sold out their roughly 500,000 units. Because I did go to an Apple store the other day, and I every time I go to the Apple store, I ask about this because I want to get this like IRL data as well. And the salesperson said, I can give you a demo, but actually I can't sell you them anymore because we're sold out here. I said, can I order online? He said, actually, I said, can you restock? Can you reorder online? He said, actually, we're like fully sold out. So you can test this at your own local Apple. Maybe your local Apple still has some local stock. I don't know. But from what I was told, because listen, a salesperson gets commission when they sell me something. And I was about to buy a $4,000 unit from him. So if he wanted to, he would have done it, right? But I was told that they're sold out and they don't sell them anymore. So that's interesting, right? But at the same time, again, cumulative volume, 40 million market size, and leader is Meta. Next up, the question is, what are people using it for? And here we don't want to speculate. We don't want to draw ideas of the future, but rather say, hey, this is today the 50 most popular apps. Okay. And I circle 3 because those are my portfolio companies. So I'm happy to say that 3 of the top 50 most popular apps in all VR are my own portfolio companies, which is Veil, DigiGods, and Battlegrounds. But these are the top 50 companies. And the common pattern you see here is that it's social sandboxes, it's gaming, and it's social media. Like, it's very, very funny, actually, that you have Instagram and WhatsApp and YouTube in the top 50, right? And to understand more why that is the case, you should go back and watch our first session of the Frontier Forum, which was our talk on gaming and UGC, where we talked about these social sandboxes in particular, even for VR. And so I don't want to repeat the same content, but there's a further, expansion on that subject. But it is important to say that, again, for today, the market that VR is resonating with is social sandboxes. In the enterprise side, of course, there's a whole different world, which you don't see in the app stores, which is training. A lot of enterprises, whether that is companies like Walmart, whether that is NASA, whether that is prison systems, whether that is a wide range of companies from private, public, you name it, they use VR for training purposes. Because you can apply the same, when you hire somebody, they usually get the same training. It's very rinse and repeat. It should be standardized. It should be scored. VR is perfect for that, right? Because it essentially allows you to train people at scale repeatedly with very, very minimal cost, right? And that's where enterprise uses it the most. But so now, when it comes to social sandboxes, there's one leader in particular called Gorilla Tag. They've done over 100 million in revenue. I believe by now they've done over 150 million in revenue. And they've been the most successful category in VR. However, the interesting thing that people are starting to work on is how to integrate AI into these virtual worlds. Because essentially, right now, you've got these social sandboxes that are essentially 20 human servers, right? Meaning there's 20 humans in the game playing with each other. Or even, I think, Orion Drift launched recently from the same company as Gorilla Tag, and I think they have 70 concurrent players or even 200 concurrent players where, again, there's 70 to 200 humans playing the game at the same time with each other. Now, if you can embody AI, right, and bring it into these virtual worlds, right? It can make the worlds even more deeply engaging and have permanent anchors to the world, so to say, that are unlike the NPCs of old video games, are actually you can have full conversations with, right? You essentially give the chatbot that you know from ChatGPT a full body. And the further step of that is then asking, hey, how can we embody more AI inside of virtual reality, right? What if we had personalized coaches, right? Many of you probably use ChatGPT. You say, hey, what's a good like lifting routine, right? Make me a workout schedule, right? Or tell me how to play an instrument, right? People do that right now, but it's only a chat format. With VR, we can actually give these coaches a full body. And, for example, let's say in the guitar example, right? It can actually play the guitar in front of you and show you which chords to hit and how to do it, right? Or there's already a popular app that does it's called Piano Vision that teaches you piano where the keys fly to you. But now you can also have an AI piano instructor where you say, hey, you know what, I want to learn. I'm a huge Hans Zimmer fan. Can you teach me the song Time, right? And he says, okay, I'm going to teach time, but there's 2 techniques you need to learn first. I'm going to teach you the techniques, right? And so all of a sudden, you can have a fully embodied AI tutor in VR. Again, giving them a shape and giving them able to show you things, do things with you, which you aren't able to do with a chatbot, and which is super unhandy when you have the desktop format or a phone format, right? Then there's mental health and therapy. And so one of our portfolio companies actually does that, right? Which is called Trip VR. They have an AI meditation therapy guide, essentially, if you will, where you can, and this is live today, you can go in your headset and you can talk to it and say, hey, let me find a good example. Maybe look, I've got this big presentation coming up, right? I'm going to talk to hundreds of my investors and leads and people from my community, and I want to impress them, but I'm stressed because I've been sick and I've been traveling and I'm trying to make this right, get this right. Do you have any advice for me, right? And then it literally thinks about it for a second and makes you a guided 15-minute meditation or so, where in the past you pull up Headspace and it's always cookie cutter. It's here's 5 minutes that everybody else listens to that has nothing to do with you, right? But with this now, all of a sudden, it's contextual. It's about you personally. It's spontaneous. It's in the moment, right? You can talk back to it. You can, whenever it says something, you're actually, you know what? I want to change direction a little bit, or actually, can you talk about this a little bit more, right? And it will do that. It will show you, it will enhance that whole experience with images and so forth. And again, it's fully immersed. Now, if you want to have a relaxing meditation session, that actually works when you have a headset on and you just lean back and you talk to it. It's not the same if you're sitting at a computer typing and explaining everything to your to ChatGPT. And it's again also way more interactive than, let's say, just voice mode. Or then your virtual companions. I mean, this is a really, really, really big one. I put it third because the first, if I put it first, sometimes people are oh, the virtual companions. Well, listen, loneliness is a huge thing in the world, and obviously people are seeking companionship, whether that is through in social media, Instagram, whether it's through dating apps, whether that's through all kinds of different ways, right? But essentially, there is a 99% likelihood that we're going to have AI friends in the future. For some people, it will be platonic. For some people, it will be AI boyfriends or AI girlfriends. Now, there you might say there's philosophical challenges with that, and you might not approve it or disprove it, But ultimately, that's going to happen, right? And people are already using those kind of platforms in 2D, on chatbots, right? Where they chat with AI and they have whole conversations because they got nobody to talk to, right? Or because they want to get some aroused and they want to flirt, right? People exist. But however, that is a 10x, 100x improvement when you move that to virtual reality, right? So you will have realistic social interactions that just haven't existed before, right? Again, massive use case that itself will probably be approximating $1 trillion opportunity in itself. And then, of course, you got everything from education to collaboration, customer service, right? If you want to, something is broken, right? But you want to show somebody, right? Right now you're in a chat room with somebody. Imagine that's actually an AI that you can show what you're seeing. Hey, my router isn't working. You look at it, this light is flashing and so forth. Again, camera sees everything. There's an AI assistant talking to you, showing you the visuals of like how it should be looking and so forth, right? It's a completely new experience that again is hands-free and only possible in this form factor. Now, in terms of why is now a good time, there's a few challenges that have been solved and some challenges that need to still be solved, right? The big ones that have been solved is what's called 6 degrees of freedom, which means you can look everywhere and you can move everywhere, right? That was not a thing a few generations of VR headsets ago. Like if you're looking at like 2014, 2016, 2018 VR hardware, it did not have 60 degrees of freedom. And even something like the Valve Index required like 2 camera towers to make that possible. Today, you don't need anything. It's just this thing, which goes into the third point, which is it's a wireless experience. Until the Quest 2, most VR was still tethered to a gaming computer, right? So we're talking like before 2020 roughly, most VR was plugged in, right? It's only been 5 years that we're now like fully wireless. Also, the price has gone down, right? Back in the 1990s, there was the leading VR stop, VRL, was selling their units for $200,000 a pop. We've gotten it down to $300. So like these challenges, check, right? Wireless, 6 degrees of freedom, affordable price, awesome. The place where we still challenge, right, is that it is still heavy. It's 500 grams, right? So 500 grams works. You can use it, but probably going to use it for less than 2 hours because after that, you probably start feeling discomfort, right? And the same thing goes with battery life. The battery life is only 2 to 3 hours if you use an extension device like I have. There's a second battery in here. Maybe get it up to 4, right? And then of course there's a form factor. Like yes, it is still bulky. Yes, it doesn't look cool yet. So the reality is, present day, no, nobody's wearing their VR headset outside the home. It is an at-home, short duration usage device, right? Which again makes sense for these sort of experiences where we say, you want to have a 1-hour coaching session. You want to have a 30-minute meditation. You want to chat with the companion for 1 hour, right? For these things, it works. Now, let's jump on next into the world of AR, which is something new we haven't talked about all that much before because I know I've been talking very publicly about VR for a long time. We made our first AR investment, like pure play AR investment this week, I guess last week, which we'll talk about in a second. But essentially, the goal of AR is very different from VR. It's that you aim to enhance your reality without replacing your surroundings. So again, the closest device I've lying around for that is the Meta Ray-Bans, but I will say these are not AR, these are just smart glasses. The difference is that they would need a screen to really count as AR glasses. What you see on the picture here on the left side is the even realities. I just ordered mine. They get here, I think, in 4 days. So I wish I could have worn them today. But they are essentially I think 30-gram glasses. 30 grams versus 500, right? So these are lighter than probably some of the sunglasses that you own, right? So they're 30 grams, super small, super light, and they have a screen in there, and essentially you're able to run entire programs on it, which we'll talk about in a second. The thing on the right, on the other hand, is the Orion glasses. This is Meta's new high-end prototype that essentially is able to do everything that the Vision Pro, Apple's glasses are able to do, but in the form factor of these guys. I was lucky enough to be one of the first 100 people or so to get a demo of the Orion back when Meta had its annual developer conference. And it's incredible. I mean, it's truly mesmerizing what you're able to do on Zung classes. Like I was able to have a Zoom call like this. I was able to talk with AI and generate images. I was able to be on social media and scroll with my fingers. I was able to like look at food and say, hey, what can I cook with this? Right? It's like this is the whole idea with embodied AI, where like I'm using AI to get recipes, right? Like in real time. The issue though is that one, this is a prototype, meaning it is not for sale yet. Two, the prototype, based on rumors, cost them $10,000 to make. So it is unclear how much this thing will sell for. And if they even can get the price down to a commercial place, right? And then three, it is still bulkier, right? So you see a real picture here of Roberto, who's one of our venture partners, wearing the glasses, as well as Suck, where they're playing a game together. They're not huge, but they're not small either, to be exact, right? Like the frames are pretty heavy. And so like, yes, they are bigger. They're like 96 grams versus 30 grams on this one. Okay. So just to be aware. Now, who are the players in AR? Some of the big ones currently are Xreal, Meta, Rocket, Vuzix, and even Realities. The current market is very, very small, right? I want you to guys be like fully aware of this. Meta is technically doesn't sell AR glasses yet, but I include them because of Orion and because of Ray-Ban. So Ray-Bans are not included here. The latest data I have is that Meta sold perhaps somewhere around 3 million Meta Ray-Bans so far, which makes them one of like an extreme success to them because they were actually sold out a lot of times. But when you combine all the other names in terms of real AR classes, we are talking less than 700,000 units, meaning this is a nascent market. This is very early still, right? But again, we believe that we are going to hit somewhere around like 14 million units in by 2030, right? Now, what are the requirements to really make AR work, and why hasn't it worked so far? What couple of the big factors are one, weight, because the idea is that look, for you to be willing to downgrade from VR to AR, right? It needs to be a device that you can wear all day long, and it needs to be a device that you will leave the house with, right? So there's a few things that go into this. One, it needs to be light. And essentially the research shows it's got to be less than 30 grams on the nose, right? And ideally under 50 grams in total, okay? Why is that hard? Because you got to pack a lot of tech in there while still keeping it light, right? Then, well, battery life. If the Meta Quest is only 2 to 3 hours, like if this is supposed to be a human co-pilot, right? Your AI co-pilot, you're leaving the house with it, it's always enhancing your life. It's got to be running at least while you're awake. So 18 hours battery life should be possible to enable continuous usage, right? Then there's something called thermal management, right? Because think about it. What happens if you use your iPhone nonstop for several hours? It starts overheating, right? Now imagine if the thing on your face is overheating, very uncomfortable, right? So that's also a challenge, right? And then of course, integrated audiovisual, right? You got to have a built-in camera, you got to have microphone, you got to have speakers, and so forth, right? So that's essentially the requirements to be able to make something go mainstream. Thus far, that's a duplicate slide. Essentially, this was meant to be the version. Right now, kind of the best classes that meet those requirements are one, the Ray-Bans, again, which had commercial success. But what they lack is the screen. And then the even realities, which again have everything. But they just came out recently. And so like they just came out recently, and one of the companies we just backed actually is building the operating system for them, and which we'll talk about in a second. And so how can AR get better, right? Like essentially it really boils down to optimizing the display, because you're able to get everything into the Ray-Bans already. So like this is solved, right? The thing that you're still solving for essentially is how good of a display can you get in there, right? And that's a function of cost, right? Because like, yes, you can pay for expensive waveguides, but that will add an additional $300 to the cost of your glasses, right? Weight. Some also cost the waveguides also way more than, let's say, micro LEDs, right? But then again, visual quality, well, waveguides are nicer quality than micro LEDs. But then power efficiency, something like, for example, micro mirrors take 1/20th the battery that waveguides take. So there's a lot of trade-offs, and we're not going to go into the technicals today because like you guys are here for investment ideas, but I just want you to understand, right? This is the key part. I want you to understand, like, one, what is the thing that's causing the bottleneck? Are there ways to circumvent it? And two, are there ways to break it? Because one, whoever is able to circumvent the challenges, right, is able to monetize early and is able to build a community today. And then two, whoever solves the bottleneck also stands to make a lot of money, right? And so there's one company, which we won't mention today because we haven't backed them yet, but for example, they are actually innovating in the micro mirror space where everybody, like Meta, is using waveguides, but waveguides, again, are very expensive and they take a ton of energy. And so we found one company, and they're actually backed by some of the smartest people in the space. They're backed by Palmer Luckey, Brennan Reeb, or Ronnie Abowitz, so like Magic Leap, Oculus, and so forth. And they found a way to essentially, again, have wider field of view, lower energy costs, and so forth for 1/20th the energy cost, right? So it's hardware experimental. I rarely do hardware, right? Which is why I'm still working through the deal. But like they could solve that problem, right? On the other hand, classes like Even Reality said, look, we're not gonna try to compete on and win on beautiful graphics, but how can we get a functioning user experience to people today? So they just use micro LEDs. So it's just green text. It's just green text and very light green images, essentially. So you can get a map of where you need to walk, right? You can get closed captioning, which I think we'll actually get to in a second. Oh, did he delete the image? There was a cool image I had for like a lot of the apps that they currently enabled. Let me see. Does he have it on the next slide? No. David. Okay, it's okay. There was a cool app slide because like so this is a live. Sorry, this is like a live product where you can buy Even Reality today. You can install Augment OS today, and here are some of the ideas and apps that you can use AR for. Okay, so one is what if you want to boost your IQ? Okay, so there's an app called Mentor Merge that's part of the Augment OS. And so again, disclaimer, I should have done the disclaimer at the beginning too. You know, not as investment advice. We might have positions, yada, yada, yada. Everything has a risk. So there's a company called Mentor. They just raised, I believe, like I don't want to announce the round before them, but they just raised a very large round. And they just completed Y Combinator. And essentially they're the first operating system they're the first open source operating system for augmented reality, right? And so there's a bunch of apps on them already called on the Augment OS operating system. So for example, there's an app called Mentor Merge that listens in on your conversation. So let's say we're in a business meeting and we talk and we talk about that we're on, you ask me about the demographics, like in VR, like for example, like what countries have how many headsets sold and so forth. And maybe I don't know the question. I don't know the answer, right? Now, while I talk, the app is researching for me without me asking, right? It listens to the conversation and it finds intent. It finds where there's a way for me to enrich this conversation. There's an insight I can provide, right? And then it gives me facts on my display. So then like I'm just talking to you and I see a little fact here that says, there's 20 million headsets in the US and there's 7 million headsets in the UK and 4 million headsets in Germany, right? And boom, I have it. So it's like it's an instant, like call it plus 10 IQ boost, right? Where imagine if you're a room full of people, we all wear that, you all just got smarter and the whole collective conversation just got smarter, right? Again, it's how AI is interacting with it. Then think of it as a social superpower. Another developer friend of mine, he actually went viral. He's a kid at Harvard who, he's old enough. He's a smart guy at Harvard that went viral for creating an AR. He hacked these things. He created an app where essentially he walks down the Harvard campus and it scans people's faces as they walk by him and then looks them up through reverse image search. It tells him as much about them as the internet can find, right? Now, he had to hack the Ray-Bans because the Ray-Bans are a closed ecosystem. They don't allow third-party developers. So he's actually friends with the guy that built the operating system. And so like this guy's currently working on an idea where he says, hey, what if we can use AR or wearables to enhance our social experiences? So when you go to a networking event or if you go to a bar to meet people, right? Right now, it's such a dumb process, right? Like when you take the smart tech versus dumb tech approach, right? Dumb approach in the sense like you're literally just walking up to anybody and trying to figure out like, are these people I have something in common with? Are these people interesting? And then God forbid they're not interesting. You kind of like stuck in that conversation for the next 10, 15, 20 minutes, right? And the night only has, let's say 2 hours. And so like you only have so much time to meet everybody. And then maybe you miss the person you actually wanted to meet, right? Well, with AR, again, uses tools like that, you can very quickly essentially scan the room and figure out like, hey, this person in the room actually has like the most in common with you. You should talk to that person, right? Or even as conversation insights, icebreakers, where it's like, oh, you two are both in VC and share this person in common. Like you both have Jonathan as a friend, right? Use that as context, right? So it's a way to use AR for social purposes. And I just looked at time. I realized I need to speed up here. There's, of course, all kinds of other cool things that are live today. Again, these are live today. Mensch Merch, live today. Contextual learning, live today. Global linguist, live today. So these are things like where you are able to, for example, translate in real time. I'm going to Japan in May. I'm going to take my classes with me, and it can listen to what somebody says in Japanese, and it can overlay the text in English for me. Right? Same way I can look at a menu. It sees the text in Japanese, it overlays it directly in English. And I know some of these things you can do with a phone, but the difference again is hands-free, casual, real-time, 24/7 experience versus always having your phone out and listening in and like typing and so forth, right? It's a different experience where it's you're going to use it way more. And of course, memory assistant, right? Like once AI feeds into your entire Gmail history, your Discord history, your text messaging history, your social media history, and so forth, it will know so much about you. And then all of a sudden, when you need to remember something, it knows your entire history, and it can become your best friend in a way that also helps guide you through life and helps make recommendations. So that's kind of the superpower that AR has, and that I think AR is really exciting for. When it comes to mixed reality, mixed reality we'll cover very, very briefly, is really just this convergence between the two, because mixed reality blends the digital and the physical world while enabling interactions in both. But importantly, mixed reality for the most part is also a simulated environment. So it's like the Apple Vision Pro, where you see the real world, but it is a reprojection of it with items overlaid. And so the idea is that over a long enough time horizon, everything will converge into one form factor, because MR is essentially the form factor of VR. It's the compute power of VR, but it's trying to provide experiences akin to AR. And now here you might see the issue, because AR is meant to be worn 24/7, and that's why it's useful. But VR is only useful for like two hours. And so that's a mismatch. That's why Apple Vision Pro didn't work that well. And that's why MR still has a pretty small TAM. But the way I look at MR is MR is a studying ground for what AR can be capable of when AR has more compute power and display strength. And I think I already jumped the gun here, but essentially the end game is converging, right? Where AR and VR are long-term trending together, where you have the Ray-Bans on one side, you get the Meta Quest on the other side, and on a long enough time horizon, you have something like the Orion come out that has the capabilities of both, where you can wear 24/7, the battery lasts, where you have the computation power of a Vision Pro, you can take video calls and so forth, you can play games on it, everything. That is kind of the end game that we're trending towards likely by 2030. But the space already is functioning today. And so now, let's get into the part where it becomes relevant for you. How can investors get exposure to both VR and AR across both public and private markets? And I'll keep this very short because the space is still so nascent, there aren't all that many ways to play it. So when it comes to public markets, I really only have two companies that I find relevant mentioning here, which is Meta, because Meta is the player in VR. Again, they own 95% of the market. So they own the hardware and they own the operating system in VR. So there is hands down, like VR exposure is accessible through Meta, right? There are challenges to that, right? Because Meta is getting competition with Google, and Meta is playing some silly games where they're trying to now also become the content provider, where they have this thing called Horizon Worlds that is essentially making up 50% of their storefront now, where they're trying to be Roblox, right? So they're trying to be the device, the app store, and Roblox at the same time. And that's actually causing them to lose favor with developers. So there still is a path here where Meta might lose its lead, right? But as it stands now, Meta still is the game in town, essentially, for VR. And I mean, there will be signs when that's changing. And for there to be a sign that it's changing, you need at least a competitor that is meaningful. I am leaving out Apple and I'm leaving out Google because Apple hasn't been very committed to the space yet. The Apple Vision Pro was a good first bet, but it didn't have the fall through that needed. So I don't think you're really getting anything material here in terms of AR exposure from Apple. Google is TBD. They will launch the device in September, and so I'll judge then. But But again, the main one is Meta. Second one is Qualcomm. Why Qualcomm? Because all these things have Qualcomm chips in them, which is the Snapdragon XR, right? And I believe the Android, yes, the Android classes too will have Qualcomm in there. So whether Meta wins or Google wins, Qualcomm is in both, right? So Qualcomm is actually an interesting kind of infrastructure play, hardware play, where no matter who wins, they're probably using Qualcomm chips. So that's an interesting one. Outside of that, I chose not to also, for example, like there are AR glass companies like Vuzix that are publicly traded. But personally, I think that is a short-lived company because they failed to win on any. They failed to innovate on software operating systems. So they're really just a hardware company, and hardware is extremely commoditized. So I can very much see them be irrelevant in a few years from now. Then, of course, you've got companies like Snap, but Snap made atrocities of hardware where the Snapchat, the Snap AR class are like this big. They're just ugly, monstrous, and I've met maybe one or two or three developers that have used them. Like they use them in a hackathon. I use them because they're like an influencer and they got one, but not really relevant. Like if you want to get VR exposure, AR exposure, Meta, Qualcomm is in public markets for now. That being said, do I think that's the best exposure? No. I, at this point in time, currently do not own stock in either of those two. I prefer to play the private markets because I think that's where you have the much, much higher multiples. So I usually never do in these sessions. I never shamelessly show because the markets are big enough. But in this case, the market is small enough where we pretty much are the market. There are, aside from Gorilla Tag and maybe Yeeps, I can't name a single XR startup that I want to be in that we missed. And I can comfortably say that. So essentially, here are some of the ways we've explored it. And like, even if you don't invest with us, maybe, I don't know, maybe you're in VC yourself and you want to write them a direct check. I would love to welcome you to the cap table. But essentially, the way we're looking at the XR space in terms of getting exposure in private markets, and some of these companies, hopefully, will raise their Series Bs and Cs, and at some point you can get secondaries of them. Maybe in 2 or 3 years you can buy secondaries off, Shapes XR or Cognitive. Possible, right? Essentially, the way we're looking at it is like, okay, what are the necessary infrastructure tooling? What are the leading content and IPs? And what are also, for example, places like operating systems or hardware that are very unique, right? And so, for example, if you want VR and like if you want spatial to take off, right, you will need spatial analytics. And so, for example, there's a company called Cognitive 3D that does just spatial analytics, where there's like 3 unicorns that do that for mobile, right? Because you want to know, like, hey, when are your customers dropping off? Where are users walking? Where are users looking, right? And then imagine feeding that spatial data also into AI, where it can actually make, like, this time AI, not talking about AI, but like in your workflows, like knowing at what points do your customers, for example, make certain purchasing decisions, right? Super valuable, right? And they're the ones who do it. Then there is capture, right? Like Twitch, of course, like video live streaming is huge for gaming, right? And there's one company that does it in VR, and that's Live, and they are the official partner of Meta. They're integrated in like half of the top 50 games, including Gorilla Tag, where you can literally pick up a physical camera from the wall inside the games and then start like recording yourself, filming yourself. There's a little iPad, like a physical iPad in the game that's done by Live, where you can like have a drone follow you, you can live stream, you can record something, and then I record something, and if I hit share, I get a little cassette tape that I can then give to you. Crazy. And then there's Shapes, like design. Well, if we want this thing to go mainstream, we're gonna need thousands, we need millions of apps essentially, right? Like a proper developer ecosystem is super necessary. And for there to be a proper developer ecosystem, you need proper developer tools. How do you get proper developer tools? Well, you need something like a Figma, for example, an InVision, where you can design your experiences, right? Well, there's this company called ShapesXR that we found a couple years ago. And by the way, I guess I'm not really shilling because some of these are in Fund 1, and Fund 1 is closed, right? We're currently in Fund 2. But ShapesXR, for example, is essentially the Figma for XR. So that's what Meta, ByteDance, Microsoft, Accenture, everybody else uses, and most of the big games, even including like Trip, is a customer. FitXR is a customer that use it for designing their virtual experiences, their 3D experiences, right? So those are like some core infrastructure and tech. Content IP, if we believe the next Call of Duty or the next Roblox will be in spatial, well, we want to back them like on day one, because by the time the Call of Duties and Robloxes come over, it will probably be too late where there's already native winners, because every form factor usually creates new champions, right? And then when the incumbents do come over, like for example, Roblox is in VR. Roblox has like a 3.5-star rating, right? And it's actually has less reviews than DigiGods. And like DigiGods, I backed at a 9 million valuation, right? DigiGods, I backed at a 9 million valuation. It has like 2 times the amount of reviews as Roblox has. It has 4.8 stars instead of 3.5 stars, right? And so you've got the ability to essentially buy the Roblox of VR for 9 million, or you can buy Roblox for, I believe is it 30 billion, 60 billion? It's something along those lines right now, right? So again, underpriced markets. And then the last one, this is our most recent deal we did last week, which is Mentra. They're essentially building the operating system for augmented reality, right? Because there is all these hardware makers, as I mentioned, Woozik and Woozik, Xreal, even Realities, you name it. But they don't have anything good to build to use. They have no good app ecosystem on top of it. So because all these companies fail to build app ecosystems, they say, you know what, we're going to build the operating system and we're going to make it compatible with all your devices. So now customers can essentially it's the way to think about it is like it's a super app that you can install on all these devices that then unlocks tons of apps on top of that app, right? And so you've got instant distribution to all those classes already sold. You don't need to make your own classes, although they plan to make their own classes, right? And what's kind of cool, right? Like the comp here is Android, and funny enough, the founder of Android, Rich Miner, is an investor in Mentra. He also invested with us in this round. And so like those are like all the many different ways of how you can play this ecosystem, right? From analytics and design to actual games, right? To operating systems and hardware, which, I mentioned this one deal earlier. I'm not mentioning it here because funny enough, I'm talking to the founder an hour. We might invest, but TBD. They essentially do, micro mirrors where they can essentially solve the issue that's making AR classes so expensive, heavy, and energy intensive. So to wrap things up, right? XR, which is AR and VR, is approaching really critical mass, projected to surpass 1 trillion market by 2030, ushering in the era of embodied AI. XR is immersive, spatial, collaborative, intelligent, which is the definitive medium to bring AI into our lives. Because through AR, humans gain real-time augmentation, seamlessly enhancing intelligence, creativity, and productivity, while with VR, our AI companions come alive, creating realistic coaches, therapists, teachers, and social interactions. Major tech players like Apple, Meta, Google, NVIDIA, and Microsoft are all investing billions, betting that XR will redefine our relationship with technology. Just as a smartphone reshaped the internet, XR will enable a new generation of AI-powered applications. Ultimately, XR, it's really important to get this through. It's not just about virtual worlds. It's about fundamentally enhancing our human capabilities and bringing our digital companions to life.